The American West has been mythologized in endless ways: heroes in white hats, villains in black, shootouts at high noon. But what if some Westerns actually captured history as it was, not just as Hollywood imagined it? Beneath the dust, the gun smoke, and the legends, certain films dared to show the grit, the fear, and the truth. These are the 12 Westerns historians say got it right. The Oxbow Incident, 1943. When the Oxbow Incident premiered during World War II, audiences weren't prepared. This wasn't a tale of glory, but of mob justice and moral decay. The story follows Henry Fonda as a weary drifter who stumbles into a lynch mob's frenzy. The film depicts vigilante violence against suspected cattle rustlers, without trial, without proof, only fear and rumor. Historians praise it because the film mirrored real-life lynchings that scarred frontier towns. While Westerns often glorified swift justice, this one showed its horror. The stark black and white cinematography, shot on claustrophobic sets rather than sweeping landscapes, only heightened the tension. It was less a Western spectacle, more a courtroom tragedy without a courtroom. But controversy followed. Some theaters balked at screening a story so bleak. Wartime audiences wanted heroes, not reminders of injustice at home. Studio executives nearly shelved it, fearing poor reception. Critics, however, recognized its boldness, calling it a Western that thinks. Its legacy grew slowly. By the 1,960 seconds, amid civil rights debates, scholars saw it as prophetic, a film that unmasked how fear twists justice. Today, historians hail it as one of the rare Westerns that refuse to mythologize the frontier. In its silence, in its tragic inevitability, the Oxbow Incident reminds us that the West was not a playground of heroics, it was a crucible of conscience. Shane, 1953. Shane wasn't just another cowboy riding into town, it was a cultural reckoning. Starring Alan Ladd as the mysterious gunfighter trying to leave his violent past behind, the film captured the struggles of homesteaders against powerful cattle barons. Unlike many Westerns, it showed the grinding conflict over land, law, and livelihood, echoing real 19th century disputes that defined the frontier. At its core, Shane is about myth versus reality, the homesteader's dream of a peaceful life. But history, bloody, contested, unforgiving, has other plans. Shane himself becomes a symbol, the tragic necessity of violence in a lawless land. The climactic gunfight, stripped of glamour, feels less like triumph and more like a funeral march for the old ways. Controversy surrounded its release. Some critics accused it of being too slow, too grim. Others claimed it glorified the lone gunman myth at a time when America was wrestling with Cold War anxieties. Behind the scenes, production was plagued by tension. Ladd was reportedly insecure about his height, forcing creative camera work to preserve his aura. Yet audiences responded. The film became a box office hit, nominated for 6 Academy Awards. Over time, scholars have re-examined it as one of the most historically grounded depictions of settlement conflicts. It doesn't shy from portraying the human cost of progress. When Shane rides away, wounded and fading into legend, the boys' cry, "Shane, come back," becomes the lament of history itself, a recognition that the West's violence couldn't simply be buried. High Noon, 1952. High Noon plays like a ticking clock, and for good reason, it unfolds almost in real time. Gary Cooper's Marshal Will Kane stands alone as a vengeful outlaw approaches by train. But the real story isn't the shootout, it's the town. One by one, its citizens refuse to help. Fear, cowardice, and self-interest replace solidarity. Historians note how startlingly real this felt. On the frontier, lawmen often had little support. Communities, fearful of retaliation, looked the other way. The myth of the brave town rising up against evil? Hollywood's invention. High Noon dared to expose the opposite: collective abandonment. But here's the twist. This wasn't just about history. Screenwriter Carl Foreman, blacklisted during the Red Scare, poured his own despair into the script. Kane's isolation mirrored Foreman's exile. Some called it un-American propaganda, while others, like John Wayne, condemned it outright. Studio executives debated burying it. Despite backlash, it triumphed. Gary Cooper won an Oscar. The film cemented itself as one of the most politically charged Westerns ever made. Its stripped-down storytelling, no sweeping panoramas, no glorious cavalry charges, forced audiences to confront uncomfortable truths. Decades later, presidents from Eisenhower to Clinton cited it as a favorite, Yet historians remind us, its power lies not in myth, but in exposing the frailty of human courage. High Noon isn't about the West we wanted, it's about the West we inherited, where silence and fear shaped as much as bravery. In the end, Kane tossing his badge into the dust wasn't just a symbol of disillusionment, it was a warning that legends can crumble when reality knocks. The Searchers, 1956. When John Ford released The Searchers, it confused audiences. Was it another tale of noble cowboys, or something darker? John Wayne played Ethan Edwards, a Civil War veteran obsessed with finding his kidnapped niece. But Ethan wasn't a hero, he was consumed by hate. His racism, his violence, his inability to belong, these weren't the traits audiences expected in a Western lead. Historians champion this film for exposing the ugly truths of frontier life. Native raids, kidnappings, cultural clashes, these weren't myths, they were realities. Ford, once a master of patriotic westerns, turned his camera on the West's shadows. Monument Valley's sweeping beauty became a backdrop for obsession and vengeance, not triumph. The controversy? Some thought it unpatriotic. Critics worried it portrayed pioneers as brutal and prejudiced rather than righteous builders of America. Wayne himself was uneasy. He preferred straightforward heroics. Behind the scenes, Ford needled Wayne mercilessly, forcing him to give a performance that was raw, angrier than audiences had ever seen. The reception was mixed. Some dismissed it as just another Wayne Western, but with time, scholars hailed it as groundbreaking, a film that captured how violence, racism, and trauma haunted the West. Its ending, with Ethan framed in the doorway, unable to enter the family home, remains one of cinema's most haunting images. The Searchers wasn't comfortable, wasn't neat. And that's precisely why historians say it got it right. The West wasn't a paradise of heroes. It was a place where hatred and love, survival and destruction, lived side by side. Red River, 1948. Howard Hawks' Red River delivered what no Western before it dared: the reality of a cattle drive. Forget quick gunfights, this was weeks of hardship, danger, and exhaustion stretched across barren plains. John Wayne, in one of his greatest performances, played Tom Dunson, a ruthless rancher determined to drive thousands of cattle north. What set it apart was authenticity. Historians note that the logistics, the dust, the river crossings, the food shortages mirrored actual 19th century drives. It wasn't romantic. Men mutinied. Leaders cracked under pressure. Dunson's tyranny reflected the fragile line between order and chaos on the trail. Controversy soon followed. The Production Code Office worried about its violence, especially the brutal fistfights and suggestions of mutiny. Hawks also fought bitterly with editor Christian Nyby, who cut the film in ways Hawks despised. A second ending, added by the studio, softened the finale. Critics still debate whether it diluted the story's power, but audiences embraced it. Red River was hailed as a rugged, masculine Western that redefined the genre. Historians later praised it as one of the few films that truly depicted the economics of the West. Cattle, not guns, built fortunes. Its legacy endures because it didn't shy away from harsh truths. The cattle drive wasn't just a backdrop for adventure. It was the backbone of an empire, built on sweat, suffering, and stubborn will. Watching Red River is like watching history gallop by, hooves pounding, leaders breaking, a nation being driven forward at any cost. My Darling Clementine, 1946. Most Westerns turned Wyatt Earp into a legend. John Ford's My Darling Clementine turned him into a man. Played by Henry Fonda, Earp isn't the flawless marshal of dime novels. He's weary, uncertain, drawn into the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, not out of glory, but necessity. Historians admire how the film stripped back the myth. It showed the uneasy alliances, the political tensions, the fragility of law in a town like Tombstone. Doc Holliday, played by Victor Mature, wasn't a charming rogue, he was a dying, bitter, alcoholic gambler. That rang truer than most Hollywood portrayals. The controversy? Some critics felt Ford had romanticized too much, softening the brutality of the Clanton gang. Others argued it was too slow, too moody, for a Western. Studio interference didn't help. 20th Century Fox recut Ford's original vision, leaving historians to debate what was lost, but audiences connected with its melancholy tone. Ford used Monument Valley not as postcard scenery, but as a stage for loneliness and fate. Fonda's quiet authority, contrasted with Mature's broken Holiday, gave the film emotional weight that most westerns lacked. Its aftermath is profound. Later films tried to copy its solemn style, but few matched its grace. Historians say it captured something essential. The West wasn't about legends, it was about flawed men forced into violence they never wanted. The final gunfight isn't triumphant, it's mournful. And as Earp rides away, we sense the truth: the West wasn't conquered by heroes. It was endured by survivors. The Gunfighter, 1950. When Gregory Peck took on the role of Jimmy Ringo in The Gunfighter, he wasn't playing the swaggering cowboy audiences expected. Ringo was tired. A gunslinger, trapped by his own reputation. Everywhere he went, young men wanted to challenge him, hoping to carve their names into history by killing him. Historians appreciate The Gunfighter because it reflected the real fate of many notorious gunmen. Fame wasn't freedom, it was a curse. Violence bred more violence, and reputation could be deadlier than bullets. Director Henry King chose a stripped-down approach, focusing not on saloon brawls or grand showdowns, but on the slow suffocation of a man's life under constant threat. The controversy? Studio executives hated Peck's mustache, claiming it made him look too European for a Western hero. They even considered reshooting. The somber tone also worried them. At a time when post-war audiences craved escapism, The Gunfighter was grim, almost fatalistic. The film wasn't a massive hit. Critics admired its intelligence, but audiences found it bleak. Yet, over time, it became recognized as one of the most historically honest westerns ever made. Real gunslingers rarely died in glory. They died in back alleys, ambushed by eager challengers, or lived long enough to regret every fight. In the end, Ringo's death isn't a triumph or tragedy, it's inevitability. And that inevitability, historians say, is the closest Hollywood ever came to the truth of the gunslinger's life. Broken Arrow, 1950. At a time when Hollywood often depicted Native Americans as faceless enemies, Broken Arrow took a daring step in the opposite direction. Starring James Stewart as a former Army scout who befriends Apache leader Cochise, the film presented Native Americans as human beings with culture, dignity, and grievances radical for 1,950. Historians highlight its accuracy. The peace negotiations between Cochise and settlers were based on real attempts at diplomacy during the Apache Wars. The film didn't shy away from showing how settlers broke treaties, fueling cycles of violence, but it wasn't without controversy. Some critics attacked it as pro-Indian propaganda. Others criticized the casting of non-native actors in native roles. Jeff Chandler, a Jewish-American actor, played Cochise. While his performance was dignified, historians note it reflected Hollywood's reluctance to give native actors central roles. Behind the scenes, Stewart pushed for the film's serious tone. He wanted something beyond cliches, something that acknowledged complexity. Audiences responded. Broken Arrow was both a box office success and an Oscar nominee. It helped inspire a wave of more sympathetic depictions of Native Americans, though few matched its sincerity. Its legacy is complicated. It was progressive for its time, but limited by its era's biases. Still, historians agree. It was one of the first westerns to admit the West wasn't just about cowboys. It was about cultures colliding, peace attempted, and too often shattered. In its quiet moments, Broken Arrow whispered a truth. Hollywood long avoided the frontier wasn't only won by guns. Sometimes, it was almost saved by words. Winchester was 73, 1950. Anthony Mann's Winchester was 73 was no ordinary Western, it was a weapons biography. Following the journey of a single rifle, stolen and passed from hand to hand, the film revealed the many faces of the frontier: lawmen, outlaws, native warriors, and desperate settlers. Historians value it for showing how objects, guns, land, cattle shaped lives. The West wasn't just about heroes, it was about possessions that fueled greed, violence, and ambition. Each new owner of the Winchester descended deeper into conflict, reflecting how the frontier turned tools into symbols of power. The controversy? The studio initially doubted Jimmy Stewart could pull off a rugged Western lead. Known for wholesome roles, Stewart shocked audiences with his raw, vengeful performance. Rumors swirled that Stewart took the role at a fraction of his salary just to prove himself. The gamble worked. His career was reborn as darker, more complex roles followed. Production was also chaotic. Mann fought with producers over tone. He wanted grit and realism. They wanted a standard shoot-'em-up. Mann won, and the result was a new kind of Western psychological, unsettling, and eerily close to real frontier struggles. Critics loved it, audiences too. Over time, historians recognized it as the first of Stewart and Mann's groundbreaking collaborations, films that peeled back the romantic gloss of the West. In the end, the Winchester rifle isn't just a gun. It's history itself passed along, misused, coveted, and soaked in blood, a reminder that the frontier was defined not by men alone, but by the objects they fought to control. 40 Guns, 1957. Samuel Fuller's 40 Guns was unlike anything audiences had seen. Barbara Stanwyck, already a Hollywood legend, played Jessica Drummond, a powerful land baroness ruling Arizona with her 40 hired guns. Instead of a male cattle king, Fuller gave us a woman commanding the West with authority, intelligence, and ruthlessness. Historians admire the film for challenging myths of gender on the frontier. Women in the West often held property, ran businesses, and defended land when men were absent. But Hollywood usually relegated them to background roles. Fuller shattered that mold, delivering a character who was as complex and commanding as any cowboy. Controversy was inevitable. Critics were shocked by Stanwyck's hardened persona. Some accused the film of being too violent, too sensual, too subversive. Fuller's direction, long tracking shots, rapid-fire editing, gave the film a raw energy that unsettled studio executives. They worried it was too modern, too anarchic for traditional Western audiences. Behind the scenes, Stanwyck performed her own stunts, riding at full gallop in her 50s. Crew members recalled her fearlessness, saying she demanded the same respect as any male star. Reception was mixed. Some loved its boldness. Others dismissed it as chaotic. But decades later, scholars hailed it as visionary, an early feminist Western that hinted at the genre's future. In 40 Guns, the West wasn't just a man's world. It was a battleground of power where women could command armies and rewrite the rules. And that, historians argue, was far closer to reality than Hollywood wanted to admit. The Big Trail, 1930. Before John Wayne became the Duke, he starred in The Big Trail, an ambitious epic that nearly sank his career. Shot in widescreen long before cinemas were ready for it, the film followed a massive wagon train as it crawled westward. No studio backlot here, this was filmed across real wilderness, with wagons, livestock, and hundreds of extras. Historians hail it as groundbreaking because it captured the actual scale of frontier migration. Audiences saw the mud, the river crossings, the sheer exhaustion of pulling families and possessions into unknown lands. Unlike tidy studio westerns, The Big Trail showed the West as raw and unforgiving. The controversy? Its realism may have doomed it. The Depression-era public wasn't ready for a 3-hour historical odyssey. Projectionists couldn't even screen it properly, as its 70mm format was incompatible with most theaters. The film flopped, and Wayne was demoted to B-movie obscurity for nearly a decade. But history redeemed it. Film scholars later recognized its innovations, wide landscapes, authentic detail, human struggle against nature as unmatched in early westerns. Wayne's performance, though unpolished, foreshadowed the icon he'd become. Today, historians say The Big Trail remains one of the most accurate depictions of westward expansion. It wasn't just about duels and saloons. It was about the grind of survival, the endless horizon, and the gamble of leaving everything behind. The West wasn't a quick draw. It was a long trail, and The Big Trail told it like it was. Ride the High Country, 1962. By the early 1,960 seconds, the classic Western was fading. Then came Sam Peckinpah's Ride the High Country, a film about aging lawmen facing their own obsolescence. Starring Randolph Scott and Joel McCrea, it told of two former marshals escorting gold through treacherous country, torn between honor and betrayal. Historians embrace it because it reflected a real truth of the frontier. By the late 19th century, the gunslingers and lawmen of legend were aging relics, displaced by railroads, corporations, and modern law. The West wasn't endless anymore. It was closing. The film's production mirrored its themes. Scott and McCrea, both nearing the end of their careers, brought gravitas to roles that felt like farewells. Peckinpah, still early in his directing career, clashed with MGM executives who wanted a standard Western. He delivered something elegiac instead. Critics responded with admiration, though box office returns were modest. Some audiences found it too melancholy, too slow. But over time, It became recognized as a bridge between the mythic westerns of the past and the revisionist westerns soon to come. Its legacy endures in its final line. As Macrea's character prepares for death, he says he wants to enter his house justified. It wasn't just dialogue, it was a metaphor for the West itself, seeking meaning as it faded into history. Ride the High Country wasn't about the birth of legends. It was about their twilight, and historians say Twilight may have been the truest story of all. The Western has always been a mirror, sometimes shining, sometimes cracked. These 12 films, in their grit, sorrow, and honesty, captured fragments of a past too often buried beneath myth. They remind us that history isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's lonely, brutal, unfinished. Which of these films feels most real to you? Comment, like, and subscribe for more hidden history.